The studio lights burned bright as Clint Eastwood settled into the guest chair, their heat reflecting off the polished floor and the glossy desk that separated him from Jimmy Fallon. The band had just wrapped up an upbeat intro, the audience still buzzing with applause as Jimmy bounced back to his seat, grinning wide, flipping his cue cards with practiced ease. Clint acknowledged the crowd with a small nod, not a smile exactly, but something close enough to politeness. His posture was straight, hands folded loosely in his lap, the calm of a man who had spent decades commanding rooms far more hostile than a late-night studio. Jimmy launched in with enthusiasm, praising Clint's legendary career, rattling off film titles, iconic lines, box office numbers. The audience roared with approval at every mention, especially when Jimmy attempted a gravelly impression of Clint's famous growl. Clint tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing in mild amusement. "That's not bad," he said dryly, earning laughter and applause. The energy felt right, loose, respectful, familiar. Jimmy leaned into it, joking about Clint being Hollywood's toughest man, the guy who never laughs, the director who scares actors just by clearing his throat. Clint responded with clipped humor, one-liners that landed hard and clean, each one drawing bigger laughs than Jimmy expected. For the first few minutes, it felt like a masterclass in generational contrast, Jimmy's rapid-fire jokes bouncing off Clint's measured pauses. The audience loved it. Jimmy, feeding off their reactions, grew bolder. He began digging into Clint's early days, teasing his stiff acting style in old westerns, replaying exaggerated clips on the screen behind them. Clint watched quietly, lips pressed together, the corners of his eyes creasing. When Jimmy asked, "Did you ever worry people would laugh at you instead of with you?" Clint chuckled softly. "Didn't really care," he said. "Still don't." Another wave of laughter. But then the tone shifted, subtly at first. Jimmy steered the conversation toward controversy, moments Clint rarely discussed publicly. He framed it as curiosity, as cultural reflection, but his phrasing carried an edge. "Times have changed," Jimmy said, glancing at the audience. "Some things you said back then might not fly today." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Clint's expression remained neutral, but his shoulders stiffened. "Times always change," he replied. "People should try thinking more." Jimmy laughed a little too loudly, as if to smooth over the tension. Instead of moving on, he doubled down. He reenacted one of Clint's most intense on-screen confrontations, exaggerating the scowl, raising his voice, turning it into something bordering on parody. The audience laughed again, though less uniformly this time. Clint's eyes stayed locked on Jimmy, unblinking. He didn't interrupt, didn't smile. The room felt tighter, the air heavier. Jimmy stopped the impression and grinned. "Come on, you've gotta admit, it's kind of hilarious now." Clint shifted in his chair. The movement was small, but noticeable. "It wasn't meant to be hilarious," he said. His voice was calm, but something underneath it had sharpened. Jimmy shrugged. "That's comedy, though. We poke fun. That's what we do." He glanced at the crowd, fishing for support. A few people clapped, uncertain. Sensing the moment slipping, Jimmy tried to recover with another joke, this time referencing Clint's age. "I mean, you've seen everything. Cowboys, cops, presidents, dinosaurs," he said, laughing. The band chimed in softly. Clint didn't. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his cheek. He leaned back slightly, hands gripping the arms of the chair now. "Age jokes are cheap," he said. "You can do better." The audience reacted with a mix of laughter and surprise. Jimmy raised his hands defensively. Hey, I'm kidding. You're a legend." He paused, then added, "Though some people say legends should know when to step aside." The words hung in the air longer than Jimmy seemed to expect. A few gasps echoed from the front rows. Clint leaned forward. The movement was deliberate, controlled. "Is that what you think?" he asked. Jimmy hesitated, smiling awkwardly. "I think," he began, but Clint cut him off. "You don't need to answer that." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Decades of authority, of sets falling silent at a glance, pressed into that single sentence. Jimmy laughed nervously. Okay, let's lighten things up." He reached for his cards, but then glanced back at Clint and, against better judgment, tossed out one more line. "I guess even tough guys have limits, right?" He winked at the audience. That was the moment everything snapped. Clint raised his hand, palm out. The band stopped mid-note. The audience fell quiet, unsure if this was scripted. Clint's eyes never left Jimmy's face. "You went too far," he said. The words were simple, unadorned, but they cut through the room like a blade. Jimmy's smile faded instantly. Clint stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor, an ordinary sound that felt thunderous in the silence. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his shoulders, and turned toward the exit. No theatrics, no final jab, just a steady walk off the stage, past the curtain, leaving behind a stunned host, frozen cameras, and an audience that didn't know whether to clap or hold its breath. Backstage erupted the second Clint disappeared behind the curtain. A producer lunged for his headset, whispering urgently while another waved frantically at a floor manager to cut to commercial. Jimmy Fallon remained seated at his desk, hands resting flat on the wood, staring at the empty chair beside him as if Clint might reappear and sit back down. The applause sign flickered uncertainly, then went dark. The band members exchanged glances, instruments lowered, unsure whether to play something light or stay silent. For a long, uncomfortable beat, the studio existed in a strange limbo, half performance, half reality. When the cameras finally cut away, Jimmy exhaled sharply and rubbed his face. "Okay," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. A producer rushed over, crouching beside the desk, speaking in hushed, rapid sentences. Jimmy nodded, eyes unfocused, replaying the moment in his head. He knew the line where it went wrong. He'd felt it even as the words left his mouth, that slight internal jolt that usually came too late. In the hallway outside the studio, Clint moved with unhurried purpose. Crew members pressed themselves against the walls to give him space, some nodding respectfully, others staring wide-eyed. No one stopped him, no one dared. His expression was composed, but there was a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there before. A publicist jogged to catch up, breathless. "Clint, we can talk this through," she said softly. He stopped, turned to her, and for a moment his face softened. "There's nothing to talk through," he replied. "I said what I needed to say." Then he continued toward the exit. Outside, the night air was cool, a stark contrast to the heat of the studio. Clint paused briefly on the steps, looking out over the city lights, listening to the distant hum of traffic. He took a deep breath, as if grounding himself, then climbed into the waiting car. The door closed with a solid, final thud. As the vehicle pulled away, the building behind him buzzed like a disturbed hive. Back inside, the show stumbled back on air. Jimmy addressed the audience with a careful, rehearsed tone, acknowledging that things had gotten a little intense, and thanking everyone for sticking around. He cracked a self-deprecating joke that landed unevenly, then moved on to the next segment. But the mood had shifted. Laughter came slower, applause softer. The empty chair lingered in everyone's peripheral vision, a silent reminder of what had just happened. Within minutes, clips flooded social media. Phones glowed across the studio as audience members posted shaky videos, captions ranging from shock to admiration to criticism. Commentators dissected Clint's body language, Jimmy's delivery, the exact phrasing of the joke. Was it planned? Was it deserved? Had comedy finally hit a wall it couldn't joke its way through? Hashtags trended worldwide before the show even ended. By the time Clint reached his hotel, the incident had already taken on a life of its own. His phone buzzed repeatedly, texts from friends, colleagues, people he hadn't heard from in years. He ignored most of them, setting the phone face down on the table. He poured himself a glass of water, sat by the window, and stared out at the city. He didn't look angry now. If anything, he looked tired. Tired of being reduced to a caricature, tired of having decades of work distilled into punchlines that missed the point. Later that night, Jimmy sat alone in his office, tie loosened, jacket draped over a chair. The laughter from earlier felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. He replayed the segment again and again, wincing at moments he'd thought were harmless, clever, safe. He prided himself on being likable, on keeping things light. But somewhere along the way, he'd mistaken comfort for permission. He typed out a statement, deleted it, typed another. Nothing sounded right. The next morning, headlines were everywhere. Some framed Clint as a relic standing up for dignity, others painted him as thin-skinned, unwilling to laugh at himself. Jimmy was criticized for pushing too hard, praised by some for challenging a powerful figure. Talk shows debated it endlessly, each host weighing in as if they'd been in the room. The moment had become bigger than both men, a cultural Rorschach test. That afternoon, a brief statement appeared from Clint. It was simple, measured, unmistakably his voice. He spoke about respect, about the line between humor and dismissal, about knowing when to stop. He wished Jimmy well. No anger, no grandstanding, just clarity. The response was immediate. Even some of his critics admitted the restraint carried weight. Jimmy read the statement in silence. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply nodded, as if accepting a verdict he already understood. That evening, when he stepped back onto his stage, he addressed the audience directly. He didn't make excuses. He acknowledged the misstep, the lesson. The applause that followed was cautious but genuine. Weeks later, the incident was still referenced, still analyzed, but its edges had softened. It became a moment people pointed to when discussing boundaries, generational divides, the responsibility that comes with a microphone. Clint returned to his work, his routine unchanged, the storm passing around him rather than through him. Jimmy, too, moved forward, a little more careful, a little more aware. And somewhere between a joke that went too far and a walk-off that said everything, a quiet understanding lingered, that even in rooms built for laughter, respect is the one thing you can't afford to turn into a punchline.